Great. Well, I hope you can all hear me. I'm sorry about the headset and the microphone, but for some reason, the computer here won't work without it. I'm sorry because I was told by my colleague Rob Lydiard that when I wear it, I look like some strange aged DJ from Ibiza. Um, I was asked by Ian Hinton to do this talk, and in many ways, I am, in spite of Adrian's kind words, magnificently poorly qualified to do it. I'm not an expert in vernacular architecture. I have to engage with it as a landscape historian, and indeed, I do teach it at a few sessions at the university as part of the landscape course, and I always think I do it rather well, simply because I don't know too much about it. So whereas when I'm teaching things that I do know about, I tend to go into the whys and wherefores and the finer detail and the minute arguments, and the poor old students get lost. But with vernacular architecture, my knowledge really isn't up to that. So this is a general introduction, and I would just want to use Norfolk in a way for thinking about the relationship between the natural environment and vernacular architecture. Vernacular architecture, which I will wisely not actually bother to define, but basically I'm talking about stuff before 1700, I suppose, basically. Now, for some reason, the screen has now, there we are, it is moving. Wait a minute, hope you can see that. Right, the basic geological structure of the county is quite simple. You have in the east, you've got coralline crag, sands and shelly gravels, great mass of chalk containing flint over the central and western part of the county, and then a narrow western area which has earlier rocks, including the green sand, the gold clay, and stuff like that. So the basic structure is simple, dominated by chalk with flint, but all that is overlain by, or mostly overlain by, glacial deposits, sands, gravels in particular, running through the center of the county and indeed the center of East Anglia, chalky till, basically mainly boulder clay, containing, again, we should say, flints. Now, all this makes for soft and often, although not always, fertile soils. And that, plus low relief and a dry climate, ensures that now those who know the area will appreciate it's essentially arable, like the rest of east of England. You can walk all day in Norfolk and not really see any livestock now. Now, moving back into the early Middle Ages, that suitability for arable farming in a period before commercial and sort of capitalist agriculture was most directly translated into population density, shown here at the time of Doomsday. Norfolk is the most densely settled part of England and continues to be really right through the Middle Ages. The soils aren't always good, and I always think that one of the key ways of understanding Norfolk is the contrast up until the 18th century between the kind of relatively fertile arable land interspersed with unplowable common land, which is what you're showing, which is being shown here from Faden's map of 1797, the commons in yellow. So it's a mixed picture, but basically we have high population densities. We also have, at the time of in common with adjacent counties, very high densities of free tenures. Now, there are complicated reasons for that, which we haven't got time to discuss. In part, they're related to the favourable climate for arable farming, but they're also related to other things. And I need to introduce here the fact that Norfolk is eastward looking. Norfolk is part in the early Middle Ages of a kind of North Sea basin cultural trading region. That generates wealth, and that generates to some extent a degree of peasant freedom too. So densely populated in the Middle Ages, relatively free, and those levels of peasant freedom increase in some areas as a more capitalist economy develops from late medieval times. And particularly that's true on that area of till boulder clay running through the centre and down into the southeast of the county. As regional farming systems develop, that area shifts more and more into what Joan Thirst used to call wood pasture farming. It's an unfortunate term, but basically they have some arable, but much of the land is laid to grass. There's much enclosure, of trees, a lot of hedges, and a lot of woodland, and farming in that mixed but biased towards cattle farming way does tend to generate wealth at middle class level, the level of vernacular architecture building, if you like. Whereas in the north and west of the county, on lighter soils overlying chalks or sands or gravels, it was a more arable farming system from the late Middle Ages onwards. A lot of open field remained unenclosed, large areas of heath, lots of sheep. This is our Norfolk horn, our traditional local animal, and wealth is concentrated at a higher level. It's a more pyramidal social structure. And indeed, moving as you get into the late 17th century towards that classic 18th century large estate structure, exemplified here by Holcombe in its vast park. So we need to think about that broad sheep, corn, wood pasture distinction. The north and the west of the county tending to be more arable, more kind of aristocratic, later enclosed, the southeast being more peasanty, more bosky, more enclosed. I'll revisit that later, but just to make the point that the environment doesn't necessarily directly or only directly determine patterns of vernacular architecture, but indirectly too, by creating spatial variations in farming systems which have knock-on effects on distributions of wealth and indeed tenure and social structure. Okay, building materials. First and foremost, we have a lot of flint in the chalk and in the drift as well. In the Middle Ages, used for churches. One of the reasons we have round towers, classically a Norfolk feature, although extending just into Suffolk, is that for flint you need something for corners and openings, and freestone was hard to get, had to be brought in from North France or the Midlands. So when a lot of church building is going on, one option is to make the tower round. That's the kind of one functional explanation for round towered churches. Stephen Hayward long ago pointed out also that they are a feature of parts of Schleswig-Holstein, North Germany. So again, we have that complicated decision we have to make. How far is this to do with cultural contacts? How far to do with basic building materials? When I first came to East Anglia long ago, I was looking at a round towered church in Suffolk, and the man sweeping up the leaves in the churchyard gave me what I think is a better explanation for round towered churches. He pointed out that in fact they were all in origin wells for water, but the soil had been washed away by Noah's flood. I think that's better, really. At vernacular level, flint is particularly used and kind of 18th and 19th century buildings, but earlier too, and particularly on the north coast. This is Stiffkey. It gets used in the form of beach pebbles, rather characteristically. So you do get some vernacular buildings, in fact, actually quite a lot on the north coast in terms of the pebble stuff. The chalk itself, used hard chalk, particularly in Breckland, again, post-medieval use, late post-medieval 18th century, but vernacular level too here at Thornham in North Norfolk, in combination with brick and often with pebble or flint as well. And we have cast stone, which is the sandstone found in small areas in the far west of the county, in the upper greensand, used in a variety of ways, sometimes by the 19th century trimmed and cut, often used just in stone form, picked from fields, and used in combination here at Hunt Stanton with a whole range of other materials. So you got cast stone, chalk, the red chalk, and bits of beech flint too. So just to make the point, though, we're not really a stone building county. You know, it's not. This isn't the Cotswolds. We have pretty poor stone, which is best used in combination with something like brick for corners, coins, window openings. And we have other materials. We have clay lump, and I apologize for the fuzziness of the slide. Clay lump, dried bricks about breeze block size. You'll be familiar with these, I'm sure. And this, of course, raises the question, what do we mean by vernacular? Because as McCann showed back in the 80s and 90s, the breeze blocks were essentially invented in Cambridgeshire in the 1790s, probably by Joseph Austin. But there is an earlier tradition of clay building in Norfolk, which we pick up archaeologically in Norwich, for example. The Norwich survey in the 1990s excavated buildings which appeared to be just clay construction. And indeed, as Keith Bacon shown, squatters' cottages at Catfield in the 19th century in Norfolk were just clay built, shutter clay built. And it's a reminder, of course, that all this stuff is what survives. As always with vernacular architecture, certain types have gone, less durable structures, less durable materials, less durable techniques. Brick, we got clay, and we got a lot of brick from late medieval times in high status residences like Oxborough. Only really descends to vernacular level late 17th century via this curious phase you get with timber buildings with wraparound gables. Here, Dairy Farm Tackleston, but Quaker Farm Rampligham, another famous example. And of course, brick encases a lot of timber frame buildings in the course of the 18th and 19th century, making them up to date cheaply, something that happened indeed to the house I am in now. But predominantly, of course, we're a timber frame county. And just to highlight the contrast of the south, typical Norfolk, steep roof, pantiles, come back to those, thatch, timber framing not exposed. We don't tend to have these wonderful displays of Suffolk and Essex late medieval 16th century close studding. The timbering tends to be covered over, in part because a lot of our timber framing, we do have, of course, medieval buildings, but the overall chronology is later than further south in East Anglia. But close, there was less timber around, it's covered over, it's not for display in the same way. Exceptions to that, of course, but this is more typically Norfolk. Now, it always seems to me that that combination of materials, different kinds of stone, limited admittedly, but mainly timber framing, allows us to interrogate some of the key issues in vernacular architecture, particularly related to plan form. Timber frame buildings in Norfolk, after the flooring of halls, tend to adapt this kind of plan, with the stack position between the hall and the parlour and away from the passage. That then replaced, oh, there you are, looking like that externally, with the door away from the stack, and that then replaced with our lobby entrance house in the 17th century, in which you enter immediately in front of the fireplace, and you can go into the parlor or into the hall. Now, there is an approach to plan forms exemplified by Eric Mercer, more recently by Matthew Johnson, which interprets plans and variations over time and space predominantly in social terms. So this is kind of seen as disrupting the traditional hierarchies of space in the hall, because where the high status end of the hall was, you know, now have a fireplace, but it has the advantages of heating the parlor and could be interpreted as being a kind of more socially distanced house plan. You're removing yourself from the farm servants into an area of privacy, increasing when you get to lobby entrance, whereas Mercer has, oh, there, yeah, just put that up, lobby entrance houses everywhere, the kind of Barrett's homes of the 17th century in Norfolk. Whereas Mercer would interpret one of the alternatives, the hearth passage plan, where the hearth backs onto the passage, as showing a more traditional form of social interaction in the house continuing. Characteristic of northern areas, smaller farms, the hall is still kind of the hall, and so the main fireplace is there, and without disturbing the basic traditional hierarchical social space of the hall. The trouble with that is that, as you can see from this, Mercer's own illustration, there's an additional stack, which does allow some degree of separation. And indeed, in general, it's quite clear that multiple stacks are more common in stone building areas, allowing more flexibility. I do think that in Norfolk, it would be good to look at plan forms in different areas of building materials, because there's broad similarities of social structure. Do we see differences in the layout of the relationship between the hearth and the parlor and the hall? And if we do, they better explained actually in terms of building materials. I just raise that as an interesting kind of concept and something that might be worth doing. Diversities of building materials in relatively socially homogeneous areas are always worth investigating. Okay, this isn't Yarmouth or Norwich. We don't have crux. We really don't have crux at all. We're a box frame building county exclusively. Now, much debate, of course, about crux, as about other regional variations in carpentry traditions. Rackham and more recently Paul Barnwell have suggested that this is related to population density and the intensity of tree and woodland management. Box frame areas are dense populations, so they tended to have coppice woodland, forcing straight growth in trees rather than open grown trees, low branching. And open grown trees, low branching is what you need for a crock. We didn't have the appropriate timber, so high population densities tend to encourage box frame. And indeed, we can see that in terms of the overall doomsday population, for example, and that really is similar to the 12th, 13th century distribution, that kind of works. Box frame areas tend to be less densely populated. In Norfolk, we'd had all these extensive commons, and some indeed, you can see the density there of Norfolk common land, and some indeed were wood pastures. We picked them up on 17th century maps. There were open grown trees here. Even on the heathlands in the east of the county, west of the county, we find the remains of wood pastures. But most wood pasture trees were unquestionably pollarded. They were cropped at about 6-7 feet, so not suitable for building. And indeed, really, most commons are already relatively treeless. So most woodland in Norfolk is unquestionably coppiced woodland. It has a coppiced understory cut at 8 to 12 years, and timber trees usually cut 60, 70, 80 years, sometimes earlier. Protected by wood bank to keep livestock out, but also to assert ownership, because these woods are cut out of the common wastes in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. So for Norfolk, the Barnwell theory kind of works. Whether it works more generally, I mean, there are problems. It isn't entirely clear to me why you don't get cruck building in an area like the Weald of Kent, where there are masses of open-grown trees rather than trees grown in coppice woods. But it's the best theory we have until someone comes up with a better one. I think Norfolk does kind of support it. But it does bring us the question of trees and woods and timber supply. Coppice woods, very intensively managed in Norfolk. We got a lot of information about that from the 17th and 18th centuries in particular, divided into separate areas for the trees taken as and when. But there isn't a lot of woodland in Norfolk. I want to, it's an interesting point here. It's a timber frame building county, but it's not a well-wooded county. The woodland is concentrated on the boulder clays in that wood pasture farming area where high densities of free tenures are as well, raising this difficult question. There's a lot of vernacular buildings, basically, that central area of Norfolk. Does that reflect an abundance of building materials, or does it reflect the social conditions which allow you to build, the wealth generated at middle class level? And I think the jury is still out on that one. The woodland, and you can see the darker greys are the heavier clays, and you can see how they correspond with that clayland wood pasture region. Woodland actually has a very odd distribution. It tends to cluster on the edge of the heaviest clay soils rather than out in the middle for social reasons I won't bore you with now. But you can see it very clearly there in South Norfolk. The dark clays are the heavy boulder clays. The greys, the lighter stuff in the valleys, and the woodland all clustering on the edge, which means the way it's very dissected, as around Kirby or Hales, south of Loddon, you have a lot of woodland, but where the clay forms a more level plateau, because one thing I've not mentioned, because I always forget to, is that Norfolk is relatively flat, then you really didn't have much woodland by the 17th and 18th century. But overall, you don't have much woodland. When we compare 19th century maps with 17th century maps, the woodland distribution and quantity is often almost the same. And indeed, in 1895, where we have our first official statistics, woods and plantations, and there'd been much planting over the previous century, they only accounted for around 4% of the land area. And as far as we can tell, in 1750, it was probably less than 3%. Moving back into the 17th century, it may have been a bit higher, but not a lot. 3-4%, certainly a lot less than 5%. So some timber is being imported, planks more than timber, but timber to some extent too, through King's Lynn in particular, from the Baltic. This is from Tyers and Alley's recent article. Many of you will know, I'm sure, on dendrochronology dates. But most probably, or at least a very high proportion, is grown in hedges. Woodland, as I say, concentrated in that broad clayland belt. So are hedges. Hedges are found everywhere in Norfolk to some extent by the late Middle Ages, but on that clayland, early enclosure of open fields, gradually increases the number of hedges, and by the 15th, 16th century, it's very densely hedged. And 17th century maps also show that those hedges are absolutely stuffed with trees. We have timber surveys from the 17th century, which detail that timber. But from the 18th century, we have some maps, wonderful maps by a guy called Henry Keemer, which show the position of every hedgerow tree and tells us what they are. This stands for oak, this stands for an ash, this stands for an elm, this stands for a pollard. And from that, we know that pollards, cropped like aerial coppice to produce wood, make up a vast amount of the hedgerow trees. Usually there are between 25 and 35 farmland trees per hectare. Yeah, it's really dense, but 70 to 80% of those are pollards, partly for fuel, partly produce useful wood on the farm. I mean, for hedge stakes, we know that is one of the main uses of pollards, but fuel. And the hedgerow itself is a fuel source. We mustn't forget that hedges it's one of those trade-offs, you know, how you use materials, how you use spaces. Timber and wood may be very useful, but what you really need in Norfolk is fuel, because we don't have any other really good fuel other than some peat and some gorse. So hedges are used for fuel. Pollards in the hedges are cut for fuel. Marshall in 1787 thought the hedges were basically the main fuel source across much of Norfolk. Now, of the timber trees, the 30% of trees in hedges which were timber, most were oak, around half were oak, the rest are ash and elm. And most of those, as in coppiced woods, were probably felled 70 to 80 years old, though it must be said that's partly an estimate based on recorded volumes. But that's probably right. They're relatively young trees. Now we need to compare that, the two sources, woodland timber and hedgerow timber. So small wood in mid-Norfolk, there's 150 standards per hectare, but the densities are usually a lot lower. You can't have too many timber trees or it shades out the coppice. So 92 at Honeypot Wood at Wendling, East Dereham, Toffwood, 40 per hectare. But only around 3 to 4% of woodland of Norfolk was wooded in the 16th and 17th century. But around 50% of the county was enclosed, with about 8 usable trees per hectare, and more even in the unenclosed areas, growing in village tofts. Now you can juggle these calculations in a variety of ways, but it seems pretty clear that farmland is actually producing most of the timber used in, well, most of the timber in Norfolk. Whether that's most of the timber used in vernacular buildings is a different question, but my guess is would be that it probably is. Okay, I'm just going to 2 more comments just briefly. It seems to be, thinking about environment and architecture, we need to unravel direct influences, available materials, flint, timber, whatever, with the indirect ones, how the environment shapes social and economic structures, regional prosperity, the social distribution of wealth. But the environment in the form of geological structures also affects patterns of contact and cultural influence, as you saw, say, with the round tower churches would be an example of that. And that's another level of complexity. So there's at least 3 overlapping things which are often hard to distinguish. And I'll just end the last minute by just raising a question, which may already have been answered. It may reflect my ignorance, but it's about pan tiles. Pan tiles are a kind of, we think of them as a vernacular roofing material, although they're introduced from the Low Countries in the late 17th century and perhaps only manufactured in Norfolk from around 1700. They're introduced to the Low Countries and they would appear to be a pretty straight example of a cultural diffusion. It's a fashion, comes in and spreads across East Anglia and is much more dominant in the northeast of the the region than towards the southwest. Straightforward. But if we look at the national distribution, and this is only a very, very, very vague kind of plot, but it's an east coast that would support, you know, trade with the Baltic and the Low Countries. Fine, that would fit. But what's it doing down in Somerset? And we can compare it with other distributions. In Norfolk, it replaced, and you can tell by the steepness of the roof, in many cases, reed thatch, which is our dominant thatching material. And a good surrogate for where reed thatch was found would be the yellow colours on this map, which is, I don't think you can see my cursor, is lowland peats, peat bog areas. All these little river valleys in Norfolk have peat in them. They would be good reed growing areas, the fens, and up the east coast, but also, of course, down on the Somerset levels. So one wonders, is to some extent pantile a replacement for reeds as opposed to straw thatch? And if so, why? If so, why? Is it that there's something about the steepness of the roofs required for reed thatch, because we have very steep roofs at East Anglia, in Norfolk in particular? Was that pantiles particularly suited that, or is it simpler? Is it that reed thatch continued longer as a fashionable material than straw thatch? So we don't have really any late medieval tradition, or much late medieval tradition, of tile manufacture in Norfolk. Is it that by the time reed was unfashionable, pantiles were fashionable? But either way, it encapsulates to me some of the really interesting questions about the relationship between environment and architecture, that we have a number of possible things: materials, the impact of environment on social structures and economies, and also the shaping of patterns of contact through geographical structures, that deciding which of those is alone or in combination generate that rich diversity of vernacular building in Norfolk and elsewhere is the real challenge and the really interesting thing. Thank you.